So, who really runs America? When you peel back all the layers, is it some secret group of bankers pulling the strings? Or maybe it's the families who own these massive stretches of land? Or what about that handful of companies that seem to control, well, the entire stock market? Today, we're going to dig into the hidden layers of power that really shape the country.
It's a huge question, right? And the answer is, well, it's complicated. So we're going to approach this like an investigation, looking at everything from the solid ground beneath our feet to the very idea of what money even is.
Okay, first up on our list of suspects, the financiers. We're talking about the folks who, according to the stories, met in secret on a place called Jekyll Island to basically design our entire central banking system. This gave them the incredible power to create trillions of dollars, seemingly out of thin air.
Or maybe the real power is something more grounded.
Literally. Could it be the mega landlords? We're talking about a surprisingly small group of families and individuals who own a staggering 1.3 billion acres of the country. And then you've got what some people call the corporate trinity. You know the names: BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. These asset managers seem to have influence over pretty much every major corporation in America. So where does the real power actually lie? Let's find out.
All right, let's start with the oldest and maybe the most obvious form of power: land. I mean, owning the ground we all stand on has been a source of control since, well, forever.
Historically, land wasn't just for building things on. It was a tool. Take a look back at the 1860s. The government was handing out these huge tracts of public land to railroad companies. Well, some insiders at Union Pacific got clever. They created a shell company called Credit Mobilier and gave discounted shares to key congressmen to make sure the laws and the funding went their way. That whole scandal just proved it. Controlling the land was a direct path to controlling the politics.
And believe me, that kind of power hasn't gone anywhere. Today, private owners control a mind-boggling 1.3 billion acres. To put that into perspective for you, that is over half of the entire country, held in private hands.
And this ownership, it's incredibly concentrated. You have a handful of families and individuals, the Emersons, John Malone, who each own millions of acres. And it's not just old money. Even tech titans like Bill Gates are now among the biggest landowners in the country. This gives them this huge influence over everything from local economies to resources and development.
Okay, so let's move to the next layer of our investigation. We're going from the tangible power of land to something way more abstract, but maybe even more powerful: the ability to create credit.
This famous quote really just frames the whole idea perfectly. The argument goes that if you can control a nation's money supply, you basically have the ultimate form of power, maybe even more power than the politicians who are actually writing the laws.
So how exactly do banks get this kind of superpower? Well, it's through a system called fractional reserve banking. It's this incredible mechanism that allows banks to create new money, not by actually printing it, but simply by lending it into existence.
Let me just walk you through a classic example of how this works. Say you deposit $100 in the bank. Historically, the bank would have to keep about $10 in reserve, but it could lend out the other $90. Now that $90 gets deposited in another bank, which then lends out 90% of that. And this cycle repeats over and over, so your single $100 deposit can end up creating up to $1,000 of new credit in the economy.
But get this. In March of 2020, in an effort to stimulate the economy, the Federal Reserve dropped the reserve requirement to zero. Yeah, you heard that right, 0%. So in theory, this gives the banking system an almost unlimited ability to create money through loans.
Okay, so if banks control the credit, who controls the giant corporations that pretty much dominate our economy? Well, for that, we have to look at the big three asset managers.
You've probably heard their names before: BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. Together, they manage a truly staggering $23 trillion in assets. Just so you can wrap your head around that number, that is more than the entire gross domestic product of the United States.
Now here's a really common misconception. You hear people say they own the world. But that's not quite right. Most of that money actually belongs to everyday investors, like you and me, in our retirement accounts. The reality is, they don't own the stocks, but what they do is control the votes that come with all those stocks.
And it all happens through something called the proxy vote. See, when you invest in one of their funds, you're basically giving them permission to vote your shares for you. And since almost nobody votes their own shares, these three firms end up controlling the largest voting blocks in pretty much every major company. That means they get to influence who sits on the board of directors.
And the board, well, the board controls the entire direction of the company.
All right, now let's explore another form of control, one that touches absolutely everyone, the national debt. I mean, if the country can borrow, it seems like infinite amounts of money. Who exactly do we owe all that money to?
The total U.S. debt is over $36 trillion. But the common idea that a country like China or Japan owns it all is really just a myth. Together, they hold less than $2 trillion. The single biggest public holder of U.S. debt is, get this, our own central bank, the Federal Reserve. And overall, the vast majority is owned by American investors and institutions.
And here's the real predicament. Most economists agree that this level of borrowing just can't last forever. Eventually, the people who lend us the money might start demanding higher interest rates to compensate for the risk, and that could create a really dangerous feedback loop for the whole economy.
So, we've looked at who controls the land, who controls the creation of money, corporate votes, and the national debt. But what if the ultimate form of control is something even more fundamental, something that actually connects all of these ideas together?
It's a concept called economic energy. I want you to think of money not as paper, but as a kind of battery, a battery that stores all of your time and skill. So the real game, then, isn't just making money, it's finding a way to store that energy so it doesn't leak away over time through things like inflation.
Now, check out this fascinating example. Back in 2017, a famous painting sold for $110 million. So, in dollar terms, its value is pretty much held up. But if you measure that same painting in Bitcoin, it has lost 98% of its value. Now, the point here isn't that one asset is better than the other. It's that the unit of measurement you use for your wealth, for your stored energy, changes absolutely everything.
And that really brings us to our final and maybe most important question. After exploring who controls land and money and corporations, perhaps the ultimate control really just comes down to this. In a world where it seems money can be created infinitely, how do you protect the value of your own time and your own effort? What is the best way to store your economic energy? That, my friends, is the quadrillion-dollar question to think about.